I was reminded recently of this documentary I watched called Hitman Hart, which is a great documentary. Hitman Hart. It's about pro wrestling.
Bret the Hitman Hart, yeah.
That's right. That's right. And he's the good guy, and he was the good guy in pro wrestling. And and he was very, very famous. He was the most famous Canadian of his time, as it turned out. And he had this role thrust upon him. He was the good guy, right?
Yeah.
And watching the documentary, I realized that people watched pro wrestling because it was a battle in a coliseum between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And I didn't understand that. I didn't know it was a drama for people who didn't want to go to movies. Like it was one level of fiction below movies. I'm not being smart about this. I'm not being cynical about this. I didn't realize that it was a mythological drama. And Hitman Hart got cast as the hero, the savior, essentially. And that was very weighty for him because that's what people expected from him. But in any case, there was a sophisticated psychological drama that was being played out in the wrestling ring, and it was good against evil. And that fantasy that you have of protecting the people you love against malevolent and malicious intruders is the fantasy of good against evil. It's just concretized. And so you see, like in our religious doctrines, at the core of religious doctrine, much religious doctrine is the idea that the entire world is a stage for the battle between good and evil. And that's right. It's right. We know it's right. You know that's happening in your own conscience because you torture yourself when you do things that you shouldn't do. You want to see yourself on the side of the good. You want to be on the side of the good insofar as you're motivated by the proper and appropriate intentions. And you'll see that in a fantasy, and it is part of friendship to defend and guard, but you want to make that sophisticated enough so you don't get the bad guy wrong.
Because sometimes the bad guy you're saying is not a person.
Sometimes the bad guy is you. Sometimes, like, it's better, and this is something I've tried to stress in my writings, is the forces of good and evil are inside. They're best conceptualized psychologically. It's the most appropriate way to conceptualize them. Get yourself under control, right? Quell the devil in your own soul. It's the best thing you can do for your friends. Because otherwise it risks getting acted out at a much more concrete level, and then it becomes dangerous. It's the protesters who are shaking their fists all the time. They've identified evil outside. And that's what they're fighting. And, you can understand that motivation. But the problem for me is, like, what makes you so sure that the evil is where you think it is? It's not. It's so convenient for you that it's outside. I don't think it's outside. In my last book, in Beyond Order, I talked a fair bit about Harry Potter, and a lot of the people who like to take pot shots at me took pot shots at that because, I don't know, they think Harry Potter's beneath their notice or something. But, I kind of noticed that J.K. Rowling made several $1 billion building the biggest entertainment enterprise of the decade and rose herself from, single mother status, unemployed single mother status to richer than the Queen, and then occupied every movie screen for like 10 years. Maybe something's going on there. Well, these complex characters, they play out mythology, and so if religion disappears in the culture in general, it pops up in our stories instantly, and that's exactly what's happened in the Marvel universe.
And what happened? I mean,
you even have Thor, for God's sake. Thor is a god. It's not even subtle. You can't get rid of these stories. They come back no matter what you do. These stories come back.
So what was J.K. Rowling doing with Harry Potter?
Well, it's the battle between good and evil. I mean, Voldemort is Satan for all intents and purposes. So it's the battle between good and evil. I mean, the second volume in particular is St. George and the Dragon. It's Bilbo and the Dragon. Harry fights a giant snake that's under the castle. It's the same story as The Lord of the Rings. And that's the same story as what's the original story?
Hobbit?
Yeah, but far before that, the oldest story we have of that sort is a Mesopotamian creation myth where a god named Marduk attacks a giant dragon named Tiamat. And that's one of the oldest religious tracts that we have. It's symbolic of humanity, right? The human being goes out there and encounters the terrible unknown, often in reptilian form. And that terrible unknown, well, that's why that terrible unknown is often evil itself. And so in Christianity, you get this weird intermingling, for example, of the snake in the Garden of Eden with Satan. It's not obvious why there should be a connection. Snake, Satan. It's like, well, what's the worst snake? It's not a snake. It's snakes as such. Well, it's not snakes as such. It's predators as such. Reptilian predators. Wait a minute. It's not reptilian predators as such, it's enemies. It's human enemies. It's the enemy in our own soul. That's the progression of the thought. It's unbelievably sophisticated.
How does it go from
insanely sophisticated?
How does it go from enemies to the enemies in our own soul?
Well, who's your worst enemy if it's not you? Who's your biggest obstacle if it's not you?
And
I mean, who do you contend with more than anyone else if it's not you?
And to the Harry Potter thing, Harry Potter has a piece of Voldemort in him.
Yes, well, that's the original sin doctrine recreated.
So
it's also the case that he can't understand evil without it. It's also part of what makes him sophisticated, right? Because he's being touched by it.
Yeah. So is that what we got to do? Is just copy the Bible? Like
we don't have a choice.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
It happens whether we want it to or not. I mean, the Bible aggregated itself over centuries, right? I mean, no human being directly oriented that. It's not something that could happen over thousands and thousands of years.
This is just the greatest hits.
That's one way of thinking about it, yes.